Hi everyone. I'm Olivia Bernard. I work at the Catskills Visitor Center. We're going to get started here in just 1 minute. I'm bringing on our expert today, Emily Carollo, who works for the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York State. I'm going to have her on in just one moment. I had to change the link for her to join, so it should just be one moment to bring her back on. I hope everyone who's watching at home is staying cool today. If you're in New York, it's kind of a hot summer-like day. Let's see, I think I got Emily on here. Hey.
Hey, Olivia. Okay, cool.
So now we are live, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. Let me pull out my questions here. Everyone who's joining us here today, thanks so much. This is our second go-around at a panel called Ask an Outdoor Expert. Today, our topic is about bears and Catskills wildlife. My name is Olivia Bernard. I work for the nonprofit, the Catskill Center for Conservation and Development, specifically at the Catskills Visitor Center in Mount Tremper, where we talk to visitors about Catskills outdoor recreation and ecology in the region, and best practices, Catskills culture, businesses, local history. Today, I'm super excited to have Emily Carollo here. She is a wildlife technician for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Emily, we had planned to have you at the Visitor Center for Outdoors Day this year. It would have been this coming weekend, but unfortunately had to be canceled, as you know. But we're super delighted that you could join us today for this virtual live Q&A. Before diving into questions, and everyone, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comment box. I'll be asking my own questions, and you guys can ask questions as well. The first thing I wanted to ask is, could you tell people at home, Emily, about the kinds of work and projects that you do for the DEC, and then what areas of the Catskills and surrounding region that you work in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Olivia. And I really appreciate being able to come on here today and talk to everybody. I was really disappointed to not be able to go to Outdoors Day. It's a really fun event. And last year, it was really awesome to be able to talk to quite a few people about all kinds of wildlife issues. But one of my favorites being black bears, obviously, because that's the program I work more specifically with. So I am, as Olivia said, a wildlife technician for the Department of Environmental Conservation. I work specifically out of Region 3, which our regional office is located in New Paltz, but we cover 7 counties. So specifically on the eastern side of the river, it is Westchester, Putnam, Dutchess counties, and then on the western side of the river, it is Sullivan, Ulster, Rockland, and Orange counties. So we cover quite a bit of ground when it comes to our regional responsibilities. I do work specifically with the black bear program, but we do kind of share our time and abilities to be able to help other programs when they do need assistance in either management projects, or maybe it's just surveying, anything along those lines. And so it's been a really cool experience to work with a lot of different program managers that have taught me a bunch of different skill sets in the wildlife realm as well.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for the work that you do, and again for being with us here today. For folks who are just joining us, this is an opportunity for you guys to ask questions, as well as me to ask Emily Carollo questions about black bears and also Catskills wildlife. There's a great DEC video. I was going to show a quick clip of it. Unfortunately, there was an issue with the DVD streaming on this program. I think maybe copyright or something. Is that a movie that people are able to find online if they're interested in watching it after the program?
Yeah, honestly, I believe you can. I'd have to double check that. It's basically a educational video or DVD that the DEC put together that talks a lot about black bears, their biology, and how to avoid human black bear conflict, which is one of the main reasons that we or one of the main areas that we focus on in our department, is a lot of helping people live happily with black bears in their area and be able to avoid as much conflict as possible. So I think that is something you can find online. If not, I know that some libraries, I think, have been provided it in the past, and some other groups that we've worked with or done presentations with, like either local Audubon societies, or maybe even some local hunting groups might have accessibility to that DVD. And obviously you guys at the Catskill Center, do have a copy and might be able to play it at the center for people to gain some insightful information about black bears and black bear conflict.
Totally. I would love that. When we were able to reopen, we should definitely have an opportunity for that. For folks listening, it's called Living with Bears. It's made by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and just a really nice 40 or 50-minute introduction to black bears in this area, both in New Jersey and New York. So here in New York State, we only see black bears, not any of the other bear species. This sometimes comes up at the visitor center. I was hoping you could go over some of the key differences for people between the bears of North America, black bears, brown bears, grizzly bears, and polar bears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, I will probably first say that I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to brown bears and polar bears. They are really cool, and I would love to be able to work with them one day. That'd be really neat. But obviously here in New York, the only species that we have, and this is true for pretty much the entirety of the eastern United States, not so much necessarily eastern Canada, that we only have black bears. So across North America, however, there are several bear species. As Olivia mentioned, there are brown bears and polar bears, and then grizzly bears are actually just subspecies of brown bears, and a lot of their distinguishment comes from a couple of physical features that they have, such as a slightly smaller size than the overall brown bear species, and then also kind of their regional distribution of where they're found. And grizzly bears and obviously brown bears and polar bears definitely get a little bit of more of a negative knock than black bears do, obviously because of some of the more concerning sometimes interactions that they have. But overall, all the bear species in North America really do avidly try and avoid human populations and human development areas because they don't want to interact with humans. So despite what I always joke with people that, what the movie The Revenant might have informed us or given us fears of, it is very unlikely to really encounter or have a negative bear interaction with many of the species here in North America. I will say it's a little bit different with polar bears because they are pretty much strictly carnivores, unlike brown bears and black bears. So, obviously, if you do go up to Canada or you visit Alaska and you are in a polar bear region, it would be very wise to speak with local wildlife officials to understand how to avoid bear conflict with the multiple bear species that they have in their areas.
That's good advice. And when you said grizzly bears are a little smaller than brown bears, they're still pretty darn big, right? Bigger than the bears that we see around here.
Yeah, so they are. On average, a brown bear or a grizzly bear is going to be bigger than a black bear. However, the larger size of black bears, or the kind of the other side of like the smallest to largest sizes of black bears you can have, can reach pretty large weights and can be bigger than the grizzly bears, the brown bears that you would find out west. So I know that in New Jersey, the record bear is well over 750 pounds that was harvested. It's similar in Pennsylvania. It's similar in New York. So if you can find extremely large black bears, and they can get very large, but the average weight of a black bear tends to be smaller than a brown bear or a grizzly bear. And that's especially true for polar bears. Polar bears are just significantly bigger. They are monsters, that's for sure.
Well, thanks for going over some of those differences. The next question I wanted to ask, and I see we're getting a couple of questions in the live feed, so I can throw those out to you too. But what are some of the myths that you hear a lot in your job about black bears, particularly ones that you wish didn't get spread so widely?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the biggest myths that really kind of getting back to the point I was making a little bit before is that, obviously you need to treat all wildlife with respect and have a healthy understanding of how they interact with humans, and making sure that, you're giving them plenty of space. But in the end, all wildlife really wants to avoid any kind of human interaction. And this is especially true for black bears. I think because they obviously have those large canines and they're big and they're intimidating, it can be really scary for people who especially may not be as used to living in black bear territory or bear kind of habitat, that it can be really intimidating to see a black bear in their yard, and people get concerned a lot about black bears coming in and maybe harming their children or harming their pets. And this is really just so far from the truth. They really want nothing to do with people, and realistically the majority of a black bear's diet is very much so a lot of insects, a lot of berries, a lot of native vegetation. And, you know, we're not on their diet. Even with the smallest of children, we're just not on their diet. And that goes the same for pets as well, even small pets. Matter of fact, I'm sure plenty of people have seen maybe YouTube videos or videos on Facebook of, like, you know, a cat chasing off a black bear. And it's kind of funny because you think, like, why is this giant bear running away from a cat? But it's because they really want nothing to do with conflict. And on top of that, they also are very lazy. So when it comes to being like a hunter necessarily, it's not really a usual behavior for them. It's not to say that they will occasionally take like a deer fawn or something like that, but typically the reason why they will go after animals such as fawns is because their natural defense is just lay down and not go anywhere and try and hide. So it's a pretty easy meal. You know, so again, when it comes to humans, big or small, it doesn't matter. And the same goes for our pets. You really don't have to worry about that kind of safety aspect. With that being said, it is so really important to manage any kind of attractants that you have on your property or around your household, because you definitely want to make sure that you're not giving black bears a reason to hang around your property, because every once in a blue moon, that is how they come in contact with people, because unfortunately maybe an adult goes around the corner and spooks a bear, and they unfortunately make contact trying to just get out of the way and avoid human conflict.
To your point about the skittishness of bears, a friend sent me a video of a bear climbing a hunter stand once, and and the hunter, all they really said was, "Oh, what are you doing there? What are you doing there?" And the bear like immediately ran down the ladder and like sprinted back out into the woods. That video always kind of pops into my head when people ask about like the aggressiveness of bears, or you know, whether they kind of seek conflict. And I should say black bears, because, you know, in terms of temperament, there are definitely differences between other kinds of bears, right? Black bears and other bears.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, but at the same time, I tell people too that even if you were to go out west, you know, a lot of the brown bear conflict that occurs it's not often. They're more often than not, it's a similar situations where they're dealing with brown bears getting into garbage or getting the birdseed, or sometimes they do have more of a predation on some livestock out there. It's a little bit different, but overall, when it comes to the human safety concern, it's the same thing, is that these bears really want nothing to do with people, and it goes across the board, how big you are. And kind of getting at that point as well, like you said, that guy just said like, "Hey, get out of here," and the bear took off. You know, I tell people all the time that when we have been trapping bears and we've caught bears 3 times my size, you know, they take off. They really take off running. When we release them, they are petrified and they really don't want anything to do with us. So definitely, you know, is a myth I'd like to hopefully try and get across to people, that you can feel safe living in black bear country, and you don't have to worry about being, like I said, revenant style attacked. You know, it's just not in their behavior, and it's not in their biology.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Let's jump into some of the questions that people are putting in the box here. So John Murphy asked, how old are bears when they are considered an adult?
So when we kind of categorize the black bears in our database, we basically have 3 categorizations. The first one is a cub, the second one is a yearling, and the third category is an adult. The way that we break that down is anything under a year old is a cub. And then anywhere from a year to 2 years old is considered a yearling, and anything above 2 years old is considered an adult. It's kind of hard to really tell the difference. Obviously, if you see a small cub, it's easy to say or see that it's a cub. But sometimes yearlings and adults can be a little bit harder to distinguish. Some of the characteristics you look for when it comes to adult bears and younger bears is that It's kind of funny how ears will almost look on a yearling bear. They almost look like very large for their head. So there's some characteristics that look a little disproportionate into comparison to the rest of their body. Whereas adult bears, especially adult males, will really fill out. They'll have really thick necks. They'll kind of have that nice scruff around their face. So it's kind of one of the ways that you can identify a little bit between an older bear and a younger bear. But it's even difficult for us after seeing plenty of bears in traps, and even estimating size sometimes can be difficult. You think looking at a bear in a trap that you've trapped plenty of bears in would be easy, and believe it or not, it's not always the easiest thing to really get a good estimate on their weight or their size or their age. So there are 3 distinct categories, though, that biologists use to break down the age groups of black bears. And I think this is probably true for the most part across most bear species.
Another question that came in is, do black bears fish?
I would say yes, but not as much as you kind of see the fishing behavior in brown bears out west, and some, especially in parts of Alaska, where there's really large salmon populations. I think it really just depends on where they're located and what kind of food resources they have. So especially in those locations out west, they have a lot of salmon runs. So that might be something that black bears do more often. So it's definitely behavior that they can do and they've been, documented doing, but it's not necessarily behavior that we would see typically here in New York.
That makes sense. Someone else asked, is there a huge difference between male and female black bears?
Size, right? Yeah, I think I see that. So there is a bit of a difference when it comes to sizes. I would average female black bears tend to be anywhere from maybe 170 to a little over 200 pounds, on average. They can be a little bit smaller than that for sure. And then the males can really have a bit of a range. They can be anywhere from, say, once they hit adulthood too, this is not considering them when they're younger and yearlings, but say anywhere from an average of 250 to 350, 400 pounds would be a decent sized male, and on average a size for males. Like I said, males can get quite a bit bigger and they can reach upwards of 700 plus pounds.
So leave the blueberries, folks, so that the bears can can eat their fill.
Yeah.
Jumping back to some of the questions that I wrote here, can you share a black bear fact that that many people may not know?
Yeah, and it's kind of funny. The one that I thought of when I heard this question was that black bears actually have a delayed implantation when they become pregnant and when they're reproducing. So black bears will actually mate in right around this time, actually is right around their breeding season, but the egg actually doesn't implant on the uterine lining until much later and several months later. And that's when obviously the cubs start growing and they will be born. So I've always thought that was kind of cool, and it's actually something that's not unusual in quite a few animal wildlife species. So it's a pretty neat fact for them to be able to have their cubs during a winter season or particular time. And it also helps them with their own survival. So if females don't put on enough weight or they're not in very good condition, they actually will not go full or have the pregnancy go full term, and they'll be able to continue on to the next year and breed again in the following season. So they can be able to make sure that if they put on enough weight and that they are able to take care of the young, they'll actually go through with pregnancy. And if not, if they're not in good condition, they won't. So it helps them with their survival as well.
And this question came up earlier. Black bear females, they don't produce young every year or two. It's a little bit further or longer than that, right?
Yep. So black bears have young every other year. Basically what happens is the rough timeline is cubs are born anywhere from mid-January to mid-February. Then they obviously come out of den with mom. They stay with her all summer, all fall. They den with her again the following winter. And at that point is when they're considered yearlings. And then after that, roughly around this time, maybe a little bit earlier, is when mom decides to kick them out and kind of say, all right, you're off on your own. I've taught you your skills. You got to go find your own territory and kind of figure it out. So it's roughly like a year and a half that they stay with mom, and it's every other year that the sow will have cubs in the den.
And that's a really interesting fact about how it takes a little while for the female to actually become pregnant. That it's kind of a neat adaptation.
Yeah, it's really cool. Some of the adaptations you see in the reproductive cycles of a lot of wildlife. It's pretty crazy.
What other wildlife do that as well?
I believe some turtle species can. I think there are some other mammal species as well. I don't know them right off the top of my head, but I'm almost positive that there's some turtle species that also do this, and they'll have a delayed implantation to be able to hold their eggs until a certain time of year to be able to lay them, so that the young have the highest chance of success once they're hatched.
Cool. Next question I was going to ask is about encounters. What can people do to prepare for possibly seeing a bear in the wild? And if they do have an encounter, well, what can they do to prepare, I guess, would be the first question, if they want to prevent an encounter or to keep themselves as safe as possible.
Yeah, so I think one of the best ways to prepare for a black bear encounter, or to prepare to be in black bear country, would be to make sure that you're never really giving bears a reason. Especially, this is more so not so much when you're hiking, because most of the time, and probably say 99.9% of the time, bears know that we're coming well in advance. They can smell us, they can hear us, so they're going to remove themselves from that situation. So it's not too common to really encounter them just kind of walking, trying to avoid us. It's not to say it doesn't happen, it definitely does, but it's not too common. I'd say more often than not, when people encounter black bears, it's probably when they're camping or they're staying a little bit more long-term in black bear country. So one of the best ways to avoid any kind of conflict or encounters with black bears is to not give them a reason to hang around. And especially when that concerns camping, it means that making sure that any food resources that are brought in are properly contained in either bear canisters or bear containers. Maybe you put in some kind of rope system to be able to hang bags and any kind of food items out of the way, which means that is hanging them above 10 feet off the ground and finding like the perfect limb that, will hold your bag, but also will not hold a potential smaller bear to be able to climb out the limb and go get the food resources. Some places that are really popular, for example, in Harriman State Park, there was a lean-to that they were having some concern, so they actually put in a bear hang that is just a wire that goes from a bar to bar, and they give a tool that allows you to be able to hang your bag up so it's safely out of the way. And using those kinds of opportunities is really important, especially when they're available. So just really making sure that bears don't have a reason to come any closer or be curious about who's hanging out and what they're smelling. And this is especially important when it comes to keeping things in tents, making sure that there's no food, there's no crumbs, there's no even really good smelling like toiletries. Sometimes they might even be attracted by a lotion that smells good. So just being aware of how you're interacting with especially really smelly items that are in black bear country when you're camping. And hiking is just really just trying not to, I guess, to tiptoe around like a mouse, but most people have a really difficult time when they're hiking doing it anyway. It's not, I don't think humans are very well adapted to being quiet in the woods, unfortunately.
That's definitely a good thing in our case, that we tend to be a little bit loud in the woods. Yeah. I've definitely enjoyed camping with bear canisters in the last couple of years, just because of ease of use. You just throw it in your backpack. They're a little bit heavier, but not having to find that perfect tree can be a little bit of relief, when you're hiking. So it just sounds like, dotting your I's and crossing your T's as much as possible before you go out is a really great way to prepare. And then also like being quiet or not being quiet, making noise when you're hiking and maybe hiking with other people.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. So as far as the direct bear encounters go, and kind of really quick, like you said, preparing is a really important part of it, and that's the same, hiking or camping across the board, especially for human safety aspects, and making sure that you have some kind of exit plan or emergency plan if something goes wrong, if someone rolls an ankle or something like that. But that should include, especially if you're going to be in bear country, making sure that you have the correct information about how to avoid black bear conflicts. And people can always call our office and ask, questions if they have any concerns about that. The other thing is that if you do actually encounter a black bear while hiking, just making sure that you kind of remove yourself from the situation. You face the bear, and you make sure you always have your eyes on it, and kind of clapping your hands, making some noise so the bear knows you're there. And I will say, more often than not, if the bear didn't notice you were there, and then all of a sudden you start clapping your hands, that bear's going to be like, whoa, and take off in the other direction and remove itself from the situation entirely. What I suggest is that even if that does happen, kind of back down the trail, stay facing where the bear was or where the bear is, keep clapping your hands, keep kind of shouting and saying, hey bear, like, get out of here, go home, whatever you want to say. Maybe keeping it PG, just make sure that if there's any other hikers around, you're not, making anybody upset. And then back down the trail, I'd say about like 10 minutes or so, and then kind of wait a little bit, make sure that you give the bear plenty of time to remove itself from that area, and then you can continue on with your hike. Like I said before, black bears really want nothing to do with humans or human interactions. So if you make yourself known and you make yourself present to the bear, it's going to remove itself from that situation and make sure that it's safe for you to be able to pass.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that's really good information. After the conversation, I'm going to post a link to reducing human-bear interactions. It's a site. It's part of the DEC site, and it's got a lot of helpful information. A lot of what Emily is saying, just written down on the DEC site. So I'll post that after the Q&A. I'm going to just take a quick look here at some of the questions that come in. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us. For anyone who's just popping in, I am talking here today with Emily Carollo, who is a wildlife technician for the DEC, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We're talking about black bears as well as Catskills wildlife, so feel free to drop in a question. We have a question here that it's from Lenore Elbricht. When do black bears come out of hibernation?
So black bears roughly come out of hibernation. Really, the main period of it is anywhere from the end of March, the beginning of April. That's not to say that some individuals will potentially come out earlier, or they might come out later. Hibernation periods also kind of vary regionally. So here in the Northeast, because we do have more of a harsh winter season, hibernation tends to be a little bit longer than, say, down in the Southeast or maybe in the Southwest, where hibernation might be more interrupted with spurts of, foraging and bears kind of getting up and meandering around. A lot of this has to do with temperature and climate, and the big thing is food availability. So in the winter, there's obviously just not a lot of food available for bears in the Northeast, and that's true for a lot of northern regions that have more cold and snowy winters. So down southeast or southwest, where there might be more food availability, depending on the season, they might be more active. But I will say is it kind of depends sometimes a little bit too with males and females. Males might come out a little bit earlier because they don't necessarily have the responsibility of young to feed. So females, especially with young cubs, tend to stay in the longest just to make sure that cubs are big enough and strong enough to be able to go out and follow mom and forage. And a lot of we do put game trail cameras on some of our dens that we visit, and a lot of cubs and sows tend to come out, and they'll hang around the den for a couple of days and kind of let the cubs kind of get their legs underneath them. And then they'll start, wandering away from the den and kind of foraging in the normal home range that the female has. So it kind of depends a little bit on the age and a little bit on the sex every once in a while. But roughly here in New York, it's about the beginning of April is when we see the majority of bears coming out of hibernation.
And related to that, one question that came in is, do males play a role in raising bear cubs?
They do not, unfortunately. So the brunt of taking care of the cubs and teaching them habits and foraging and all the skills they need to survive falls on the sow.
And then someone else asked, are adult black bears solar animals, or will they travel together in pairs or more?
So black bears as an adult, they are solo animals. They do tend to be individuals and meander around on their own. You will see sometimes what people see are 3 or 2 larger bears that might kind of be following each other around. More often than not, it tends to be a sow with yearlings. Especially if it was a good year that they were able to get pretty big. Some yearlings might go off on their own at a little over 100 pounds, so they can be pretty big by the time they leave mom. So more often than not, if you see a group of bears, it's probably a family group of the mom and then whoever her cubs were from that previous year. However, sometimes you will see males and females, especially during this time when it's the peak of the breeding season, which is June and July, that you'll see sometimes a male might be following a female in hopes that they can breed and she can reproduce in the winter.
Someone asked, I've heard that if you have a black bear encounter, you should bang pots and pans, making noise and walking backward, which is something I think you were talking about a little earlier. Mm-hmm. Then she also asked, what about eye contact?
Yeah, eye contact is kind of one of those things that is a little interesting when it comes to animal behavior in general. This isn't necessarily specifically speaking for black bears. And what we suggest is, or what some biologists would suggest, is to not maintain eye contact. And it's not necessarily because it's like you're guaranteeing you're going to have the bear kind of charge you, but a lot of wildlife and animals in general, eye contact can mean a whole variation of things. And when I say keep your eyes on the bear, I mean just making sure that you're watching what it's doing, where it's going. If you make eye contact, it's fine, but I wouldn't be staring the animal down. And what I kind of tell people is you always got to think about it a little bit in a human sense. Someone just staring you down in the face and staring you right in the eyes, you'd probably be a little intimidated. So you don't want to necessarily kind of give off an idea of like, I'm going to attack you or I'm going to harm you, but you're just trying to tell the bear, I'm here, I want you to go the other direction. Like, I'm going to back away and remove myself, but I'm over here, so you stay over there, or maybe you wander off. So that definitely, eye contact is something I wouldn't really suggest with many animal species. And honestly, this even goes beyond into our own domestic animals, is that there's a whole behavioral biology behind eye contact and all that kind of jazz that I can't really fully speak to, but I would suggest that, you don't stare down anyone's dog or black bear anytime soon. It's probably not a good idea.
Totally. It can be intimidating. It can kind of like trigger the fear response or the flight or fight response. We're wildlife just like bears. So
exactly.
If it's not ideal for humans, it's probably not ideal for them either.
Exactly.
But good question. Someone asked a question about bear spray. Is bear spray legal in New York? To the best of my knowledge, yes, it is. I worked at REI for several years, and we used to sell it to campers. I would tell people that you don't need it in New York State, but you can definitely use it. That it's more intended for like grizzly bear country when you're out west. But to answer Amy Bennett's question, you can buy bear spray in New York.
I hate to conflict with you, but actually, I don't believe you can. You can
really?
Carry spray, like pepper spray. You can carry pepper spray. That's like a self-defense thing. So that's where it can be available to buy. But I believe it's something along the lines of the strength of some bear sprays that could be sold more commercially for specifically like bear encounters out west and stuff like that is illegal in the state of New York. And I think it has human safety concerns really at the front of it, because if it is improperly used, it can be really painful, potentially really damaging. But you can carry normal like pepper spray, but obviously this is also kind of goes a little bit beyond just like wildlife legalities and being able to find things, and always abiding by and potentially looking into like New York State regulation, just general laws and codes is always a good idea, or even local laws and codes, because you never know what might change or vary from county to county or from region to region.
That's interesting about bear spray. Maybe the law has changed in the last few years. And just from our conversation, you know, if there are ways that you can prepare or prevent those kinds of encounters, those are great things to focus on, rather than, you know, being too afraid by having to carry that stuff. But
yeah, and what I tell people too is that the likelihood that you'll really even have to use something like that is pretty much slim to none. And what I tell people is probably a more useful tool to carry with them when traveling is an air horn. You can get like these little tiny pocket ones that are super small and they're super loud, they're super surprising, and those are really great to use to harass black bears, and maybe even any kind of other wildlife that you feel as though it might be too close of an encounter or too close for comfort kind of deal. Air horns are really great and packable.
Yeah, that's a lightweight camping essential. That's a great idea. Carry an air horn.
Yep.
We sell bear bells at the visitor center. Those are a little less noisy, but
helpful. Yeah.
People say that they're helpful. Yeah. Tying into other wildlife in the Catskills, what is one of your favorite aspects of the wildlife in the Catskills region?
I think one of my favorite aspects about the wildlife in the Catskills region is there is such an immense diversity of it, especially, you know, coming here and living here for a little while in the Hudson Valley. I'm actually originally from northern New Jersey, so not too far from here. And, you know, the diversity is really great. And what I appreciate about it the most is kind of bringing me back to where I grew up as a kid and the wildlife experiences that I was able to have. And, you know, with that little side note of I grew up in like a very big bear country. And, you know, I always tell people like one of 6 kids and we were raised fine. And we were, you know, had no real problems with bears other than the occasional trash bear that my mom did a really good job of using things like ammonia or bleach to keep them out. So I think it's pretty cool to go back to, you know, kind of where after life and coming back to an area where the wildlife is really familiar. And, like I said, it has a really cool diversity that, is really fun to experience. And what's neat about the Catskills is you can get some pretty awesome encounters, with wildlife that, you might not be able to in other parts of, the country, or the world, even because of really how accessible the outdoor world is in New York. For example, I actually was just hiking in Minnewaska the other day, and we encountered a porcupine that my dogs desperately wanted to try and go after, and I dragged them away to make sure we didn't have any bad encounters. But it's really cool being able to see animals like that you know, people sometimes only see in pictures, which is really neat. Porcupines
are amazing. I saw my first one in Minnewaska too, not too long ago, about a year or so ago. Yeah. They're amazingly good climbers.
Yeah. It's pretty wild. They're pretty cool. They're pretty cool creatures. I don't know a lot about porcupine biology, but you know, they are really cool.
You're right. It's wonderful that we're able to see that kind of wildlife in the Catskills and in the Shawangunk region. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen a bobcat or a fisher? How common are they? So bobcats and fisher are pretty darn common when it comes to their populations. They're extremely stable in the state of New York, and especially in certain regions like the Catskills or the Adirondacks. With that being said, I have never seen a bobcat in New York, and I've never actually seen a fisher. Unfortunately, actually, that's not true. I saw a deceased fisher on the side of the road. So that was the only experience with fishers I've had. But with that being said, I know plenty of people who have seen them before, especially this tends to be people who are more like outdoors, women and men who go outside a lot, because they are pretty elusive, and so are bobcats. I have seen bobcats in other parts of the country, but I've actually never seen a bobcat here in New York. And I've never seen a fisher, period, other than the one that was unfortunately hit by a car on the side of the road. They have very stable populations though, and they, you know, with the right settings and the right amount of time outside, you could definitely have the possibility of seeing one. Someone said in the comments that she's also from northern New Jersey. It's beautiful in that region. If you've never been out to northern Jersey, there's lots of like farm country, lots of nice hiking. Where in northern New Jersey are you from?
I'm originally from Sussex County, so I'm not far from like the Orange County border. So that's why it's a lot of really similar kind of habitats and forests and stuff like that. So it was a pretty cool opportunity to be kind of in a very rural part of the States and kind of have that connection to the outdoors and wildlife. It was really neat.
Someone put in, can black bears open car doors?
Believe it or not, they can be very dexterous, and there definitely have been reports of bears getting into cars by not necessarily breaking windows. They have gotten through some doors every once in a while by just, trying, especially doors that, and we've seen this, you can see this with dogs too, like doors that kind of have the handle you just push down and open rather than twist. So they can be very dexterous for sure, and they can figure out how to gain access to some places like that. So that's why it's always a really good suggestion, especially if you live in bear country, to not keep anything that might be worthwhile in your car. This could be something as simple as like a cup of coffee, or it could be an old bag of chips that maybe a kid left in the back seat by accident. So just kind of being aware of that and making sure that the car is as less attractive or least attractive as possible. But with that being said, it is a bit of a step above for a black bear to kind of take those opportunities. And I'd say more often than not, the bear was probably attracted to the area for maybe something else that seemed a little bit more accessible, and maybe it wasn't successful, or maybe it was, and then it also found, the car or a shed or something like that and decided to try and get in as well.
They do seem to be attracted to things not just like classic food, like you mentioned toiletries before, how they can be attracted to things like toothpaste, and beehives is a big one, I think. That they're attracted to people's beehives, bird feeders. How early in the year should people living in bear country bring in their seeded bird feeders?
For seeded bird feeders, we recommend at the DEC that people bring them in by April 1st. But that can definitely vary by region, and it can vary by bear activity. We did have quite a few bear reports in March, and especially this was more so regarding a lot of bird seed and bird feeder, concerns and complaints. And I think a lot of that had to do with how mild the winter kind of was. So there was a little bit more activity by black bears, especially later on in the season. So the DEC guidelines are you take down bird feeders April 1st and you don't put them back up until November 1st. But there is still bear activity, beyond November 1st as well. So kind of monitoring the situation and making sure that if you do end up seeing that your bird feeders were taken down by a black bear, it's a really good idea to probably take them back down at least for another month before you put them back up for the winter.
So April through November, that's a good guideline to go by.
Mm-hmm. And this also includes hummingbird feeders. Sometimes people think that because it's just sugar water or something like that, it's not as attractive. But once a bear does find one of those resources, they will unfortunately go for it, and they will be back. They have a very, very, very good memory of where they found resources in the past.
So that implies to bird feeders, suet feeders, and hummingbird feeders. Mm-hmm. I know some people who will be sad to hear the last part about hummingbird feeders. Yeah,
and there are a lot of ways that you can attract bird species to your backyard or right up to your window. There are some really great, especially if you go to groups like the Cornell Ornithology Lab or Audubon societies. They have some really handy tricks about how you can attract birds to your backyard without attracting wildlife that you may not want to attract, like black bears, because obviously this isn't a problem that's just isolated in New York. This is a problem that can be, identified throughout the United States, and, as a wildlife conflict as a whole is found throughout the world. So, there definitely are plenty of techniques like, using bird baths or trying to have certain kind of cover or habitat that might attract certain bird species, building bird houses that are specific to certain bird species as well is really successful. And I can speak to this from actually, going back to my own growing up and everything like that. My mom has a million bird houses all around the yard, and they obviously don't attract bears in the sense of they're not the food, they're just the birds living there. So she always had quite a few birds flying around the house, and a lot of it was really just due to the fact that there was a lot of shelter for them. The bird houses really provided a great opportunity for them to nest and raise fledglings and chicks.
That's great. Yeah, the birds can find their own food generally, right? Especially when it's so warm outside and there's lots of stuff growing everywhere.
Yep, 100%.
And then with like hummingbirds, if you plant like pollinator friendly flowers, then you might be more likely to see them zip in, and trumpet flowers and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also something that we used to get hummingbirds all the time, and they would just, because of these couple planters that my mom had up that were just like some of the trumpeter flowers or anything like that, and it was really cool. That was really what they were attracted to. My mom, I don't think she ever had a hummingbird feeder. It was just those flowers. It was pretty neat. So there's definitely a lot of natural ways that you can attract birds to your yard for good viewing opportunities.
Just a couple more questions that I have here. Thanks so much for taking this time, Emily, and for answering all of these questions. It's really appreciated to have more resources and more information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of a funny question that came in. What kind of bear is Smokey the bear?
Honestly, that's a really good question. I would gander he's a brown bear because of his color, but that's not necessarily true, because you can find different color variations of black bears. You can find cinnamon bears. You can, as some people know, spirit bears that are out in some of the more temperate forests of Alaska. So you can get some good color variations of black bears across the United States. And actually, even here in New York, there's been quite a few sightings of cinnamon bears, specifically in Sullivan County, which is pretty neat. And I do know they've had quite a few sightings of cinnamon bears in like Northeast Pennsylvania. So my hope is that cinnamon coloration kind of expands a little bit in the black bear population. That'd be pretty cool. But I would gander from the history of the Forest Service, and also from the looks of Smokey the bear, he's probably a brown bear. But don't quote me on it. You might want to look that up at the U.S. Forest Service website.
She wrote Paddington Bear. I remember that book.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
That's really interesting about some New York State bears, or bears in this region, having the brown coloration. That would definitely take me by surprise in the woods, seeing a black.
Yeah, and I'm sure some people will be like, wait a minute, I thought there was only one kind of bear in New York.
An earlier question that I skipped over that I wanted to ask is what role black bears play in a healthy ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So black bears, just like every single species that you can find in our native ecosystems, play incredibly important roles to the healthy functioning of those ecosystems. I'd say that black bears in particular, help manage a lot of seed dispersal, actually, because a large part of their diet is native vegetation related. It's also insect related, but especially that native vegetation when it comes to certain berries. With their scat, they're able to not only provide the seed dispersal, but maybe even a little fertilizer to help those plants grow. Especially true for even like acorns or for beech nuts. These are all kinds of seeds that maybe are part of the dispersal process. The other thing that black bears do provide is they do occasionally, like I said, hunt deer fawns, white-tailed deer fawns. So I wouldn't say that they play a huge role in population control, because they aren't a really major predator factor when it comes to certain deer populations. But bears as a whole are, being somewhat carnivorous in some species and entirely carnivorous in others, do sometimes play important roles in population management for some prey species. And then on top of that, black bears with their movements across the landscape and how they interact with the landscape, They can sometimes, rip apart some dead trees, or they might even knock down some dead trees, opening canopy availability for other younger tree species to grow. So it's kind of a wide range of processes and tasks that they have throughout the ecosystem that connects them back into a healthier ecosystem overall.
Thanks for answering that. One of my favorite quotes is one that's, I think it's John Muir, but I'm not, I have to double check, but it's when you tug on one strand of the environment, you find it connected to the rest of the world. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's something I've always reflected on when thinking about all the different wildlife and organisms that we have in this area and all over.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more question that came in from Mary Haley Leslie, and she said, "Are there more bears this year, or are they more bold about coming into neighborhoods?"
So we've gotten this question a couple times from our general wildlife line that people can call if they have wildlife concerns, and there aren't necessarily more bears this year. The population has remained relatively the same in most areas in New York for a few years now. I'd say in some areas they might be dispersing a little bit more. They might be even increasing in some areas, but it's kind of hard to say, in the immediate, because a lot of the population estimates that we do and density estimates that we do are actually a couple years behind because of the data and how we collect it and how we analyze it. But overall, I would say it's not because there's necessarily more bears in an area. What I will say is there may be a little bit of interaction with how quiet some of our urban areas have been because of, obviously that's everything that's going on with COVID-19 and the lack of, human activity that's been happening in some areas, especially more urban centers. But I would say that overall, it's not because there's more bears, and that it's not necessarily because they're more bold. I think that, sometimes communities have years where bears are more of a problem, and sometimes they don't. And it doesn't necessarily have any real rhyme or reason, other than sometimes when years are not as prolific with food resources, like natural food resources for black bears, we do identify more conflicts being called into our office and across the state. But that's not true for this year. There, obviously there's been plenty of rain, there's been plenty of vegetation, there's no drought conditions. And so it's kind of hard to tell exactly what some communities and why some communities might be facing more difficulties than others.
So always a good idea to protect things like your garbage, compost, bird feeders. But it sounds like especially in drought years, that's something you want to be especially cautious of.
Yeah, definitely in years that native vegetation is lacking, it's really important. But it's something that we should be aware of at all times, because no matter what kind of year we're having, the availability of unnatural food resources like garbage and like bird feeders is definitely relevant. And with that being said, kind of a side note about this time of year as well, as I was kind of talking about, also there are right now is one of the biggest movement periods for black bears seasonally. And a lot of that has to do with several factors. The first being that it's breeding season. So obviously males and females are moving a lot more in their home ranges than they normally would. There's also the dispersal of yearlings that have been booted by moms. So they tend to be the bears that we find in trouble sometimes, like in urban centers or in places that they're really not supposed to be. And a lot of that just has to do with them venturing around and trying to establish their own home ranges and their own territories. Unfortunately, this doesn't only necessarily apply to yearlings. It could also apply to, males especially that are a couple of years old and they're still really trying to find the perfect place to settle down. So there's a couple of reasons why bears right now are really on the move, and it just essentially increases their likelihood that they could come across something that might cause some trouble. So, the specific times of year to really be aware of unnatural resources like bird feeders or garbage. It's really the summer. You got to be really, really extra cautious about, where you place these things or whether or not you even have them available or out. But overall, this is something that every summer season we should be concerned about, no matter what kind of food availability there is naturally for black bears.
Well, you've given us some fantastic food for thought and things to put into practice at home and in the backcountry for bear safety. Thank you again for bringing your expertise and your knowledge to this talk today. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up?
I think I do see one here. Says, do black bears carry any disease? One disease that is probably more applicable to people who hunt and consume bears is something called trichinosis. It's a parasite that can be found in some black bear populations. I think in some populations it's more prevalent than others, but I'm not 100% sure when it comes to trichinosis. But part of it is just making sure that when you do consume the meat, it is cooked properly. It's similar to actually pork and making sure that it's cooked properly. Some other diseases that have been watched in black bears specifically recently are things like sarcoptic mange. This is really not that prevalent in New York. There have been a couple cases, but not as many as in comparison to other states like Pennsylvania that's doing a lot of work with sarcoptic mange. And that is something that technically humans can get, but it's not something that's very likely to be transferred. A lot of it is because of the fact that you have to have very close contact with that kind of mite. And so, you'd almost have to be like hugging the bear to be able to get it. So that's something I think biologists and technicians worry more about. And when it comes to pets, actually, you don't really need to worry too much about mites, because if you use any kind of flea and tick preventative, majority of the time it prevents any kind of those infestations as well. So there are a couple of diseases that are kind of watched out for and monitored in black bear populations, but overall they're a pretty healthy species. And I will say that black bears do have incredible immune systems. And I know there has been some research in the past with other medical fields and human medical fields about why their immunity is so good and why their health, systems are so capable of fighting off disease. And I think that in the long story short of it is that all wildlife really has to make sure that they are able to kind of survive these various events. Otherwise, they don't have a vet or a doctor like we do. So across the board, their ability to survive is pretty significant with all wildlife.
Interesting. So humans might have some things that we can learn from black bears about their immune systems. Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy that really think about it. It's how we've learned a lot about human, medical breakthroughs is from our natural world. It's pretty wild.
Well, that's, let's see.
And I think I have one more about, this is a pretty interesting, what does bear poop look like?
Oh, yeah.
It's, I think really the best way to describe it is if you really just go on Google and you type in to look up images of it. But, especially when you see kind of like more of a cylindrical appearance to the scat, and you'll typically find it in places where they have already been kind of foraging. So say you're in a blueberry patch, don't be surprised if you find some bear scat, because they probably, they love to just like sit down and pop down and pick the right berries off and go from there. So you'll also notice one of the biggest indicators of what kind of species may have left a scat is what you find in the scat. So in black bear scat, you'll find a lot of seeds, you'll find a lot of foliage, you'll find a lot of insect shells and insect carcasses as well is a really big one. So there's a little bit of a shape dynamic to it, and obviously a general size that you can always kind of identify. But what you find in the poop is really the most important part of it in identifying any kind of wildlife scat.
In the past, you've taught a great tracking class at the Catskills Visitors Center. And I remember that being one of the things you talking about is like different scat for different wildlife and how that helps you identify it.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm crazy sometimes because I'll stop in the middle of the path and be like, do you not see this really cool coyote scat? You know, and I'm like, yeah, that's great. It's kind of gross. You're that interesting.
Coyote scat is interesting. You have like little bits of fur and
yeah, there's little bones. It's really neat. And where they leave it, I think, is always funny. I think my dogs find it more often than not. You know, they'll be the first ones that go roll up on it and start sniffing. I'll be like, oh, what'd you guys find? You know, like it's normally something pretty good. So
where do they typically leave it? Not just like on a trail, a hiking trail, or like
yes. Some species, like coyotes and foxes and bobcats, they like to be really evident about where they're going to the bathroom because they kind of use it as a as like a marking tool. So they'll leave it like dead center of the trail. So if you're walking down a trail and there's a scat dead center of the trail, that's maybe not someone's dogs. You know, there's a good chance that it might be one of those three guys, and it's always a good idea to kind of learn the shapes of them and what's, you know, size you're roughly looking at and what you might find in the scats too.
Yeah, scat and tracking guides are a lot of fun, especially in the wintertime. Well, for speaking personally, the tracking guide is fun in the wintertime because you see all kinds of like prints in the snow.
Yeah.
Like, oh, what was that? What was around here? So tracking and scat guides are great to pick up.
Yeah, absolutely. They're a lot of fun. And I'm by no means, you know, like an expert when it comes to this too. I'm still learning every time I go out there and I look at something, and I still sometimes look at a track and be like, is it this or is it that? So it's always a cool skill to continue to brush up on, no matter how old you are, no matter how practiced you are.
Well, I think you're still an expert. Thank you so much again for joining us today. I hope we'll be able to have you back at the Visitor Center when things are a little bit more normal. And I hope you stay well. I hope everyone watching stays healthy and well. And thanks so much for everything and for watching today, guys. And thanks, Emily.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. I really appreciate it. And hopefully I'll be back, like you said, at the Catskill Center at some point. I would love to, you know, continue to do presentations with you guys. And hopefully Outdoors Day is set to go next year and we'll be able to see everyone then.
That would be great. Next June. We've all got our fingers crossed.
For sure.
Well, thanks again, and have a good rest of the day.
Yep, no problem. Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye. Thank you.